The US-China rivalry intensifies. Two of the most powerful countries on Earth see relations hit a new low. But are we really heading for the next Cold War, or has it already begun? I'm Ali Aslan, and today's newsmaker is the growing tension between the US and China. At the start of this year, Donald Trump claimed US-China relations had never been better. Fast forward a few months and nothing could be further from the truth. They've clashed over the coronavirus, Beijing's treatment of the Uighurs, and, of course, Huawei. The US has accused the Chinese of using the telecoms giant to spy on behalf of its government, an allegation Beijing denies. Now, of course, the bad blood between the economic powerhouses isn't new, but right now, each day appears to bring a new dispute. And, as Adam Pletz reports, the latest is over the contested South China Sea.
Trouble is brewing in the South China Sea. The US says Beijing is building a maritime empire at the expense of its neighbors.
And we will support countries all across the world who recognize that China has violated their legal territorial claims as well, or maritime claims as well. And we'll go provide them the assistance we can, whether that's in multilateral bodies, whether that's in ASEAN, whether that's through legal responses. We'll use all the tools we can.
It's a dramatic departure from US policy, which previously supported territorial dispute resolution through the UN. China's claims date back to the 1940s and include the vast majority of the South China Sea. But Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines have significant competing claims. The stakes are high. Annually, more than $3 trillion of global trade passes through the strategic shipping lanes, and there is the potential for extensive oil and gas production. The disputed areas include hundreds of islands, some of which have been occupied by China for decades. But since 2013, what were ramshackle outposts have been transformed by land reclamation and runway construction into heavily fortified atolls, dubbed the Great Wall of Sand. The US Navy regularly patrols close to the Chinese-occupied islands in what it calls freedom of navigation operations, which China believes to be a direct provocation.
The United States has always refused to join the United Nations Conventions on the Law of the Sea, has frequently pulled out from international organizations and treaties, has applied international rules in a selective way, and has frequently sent large numbers of advanced warships and military aircraft to escalate militarization in the South China Sea, to promote a strong power logic and hegemonic practices.
But US hegemony is under threat from a rapidly rising China. And with American elections just around the corner, the Trump administration wants to show it's tough on Beijing. Washington has imposed sanctions and tariffs on China and is now claiming credit for the UK's decision to ban Chinese telecommunications company Huawei from its 5G network due to security concerns. As Beijing and Washington continue to trade blows, could it be that we have already entered a new Cold War? And could it end in real conflict? Adam Pletz, The Newsmakers.
Well, let's go to New York now, where I am joined by Ian Bremmer. He's the founder and president of GZERO Media and the Eurasia Group, a leading political risk firm. And Lee is an expert on China's economic relations and author of the book, What the US Can Learn from China. And in Washington, D.C., is national security consultant Joseph Bosco. He was the U.S. Defense Department's China director under George W. Bush. Ian, judging by the accumulation of disputes between the U.S. and China, it seems that relations between the two countries have hit an all-time low. Is it too soon to speak of a new Cold War?
It's certainly true that we're heading in that direction. I don't love the terminology because, of course, the amount of interdependence between the U.S. and China will remain so much greater than ever existed between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. I mean, for example, no matter how bad relations get, reasonably speaking, in 5 years' time, if I go to a Walmart, I'm still going to buy a lot of goods from China. Reasonably speaking, in 5 years' time, if I look at a mid-tier university or college in the United States, they're still going to get a lot of revenue from Chinese students coming in, paying full tuition. So those things aren't going away. But it is certainly true that if you look at pretty much every piece of the US-China relationship right now, whether we talk about security or technology or culture or diplomacy or economics and trade, those relations are actually getting worse. And furthermore, it's probably the only major area of foreign policy in the United States right now where there's broad bipartisan agreement. I mean, not just from the Trump administration, but if you talk to Biden's senior advisors right now, they don't agree on perhaps the stylistics of Trump's lack of diplomacy, but they agree broadly with where his policies are going. And you couldn't say that about just about any other area of U.S. foreign policy right now.
And certainly tensions were already there before the coronavirus emerged, but the pandemic seems to have exposed the depth of the mutual distrust. Donald Trump, of course, has criticized China for what he perceived the lack of transparency, and even went as far as to call the coronavirus itself the China virus, whereas China might see the coronavirus as an opportunity to exploit U.S. weaknesses. Are the gloves off?
Yes, I think that actually we've already more or less moved towards the Cold War mentality in the U.S. Trump's national security strategy basically uses the word overmatch, and that really means military dominance that they insist on having over any rival, including China. And what we're seeing is basically a lot of tactical moves to try to contain China. As Ian mentioned, it's all across different areas of the economy, and I think it's just going to accelerate and get worse. And yes, you're not going to see any disagreement in Washington because the foreign policy community pretty much doesn't debate this issue. They basically all agree that the U.S. must be superior to all nations in order to make sure that there is never going to be an even playing field to challenge the U.S. And so given the situation today, I think that it will definitely deteriorate more, and it could easily turn into a military confrontation.
And certainly a military confrontation might be looming. But before we get there, Joseph, China seems to be indeed the only reason, or the only argument, if you will, the anti-China sentiment is what a deeply divided Washington, D.C. can agree on these days. Now, Ian is not so comfortable with the terminology of calling it the new Cold War. What about yourself?
I must respectfully disagree. I'm quite comfortable with using the term Cold War, new Cold War, Cold War II. And indeed, I would argue that the Cold War has been underway literally for years, if not decades. That is, it's been conducted, been waged by China, and also, we might add, by Russia, against the United States and against Western interests and values. It has emerged in recent years more dramatically, but it's been there right along. We had Deng Xiaoping back in the 80s who advised his colleagues, hide your capabilities, bide your time. What did that mean? It meant we have a plan for the world, but we're not ready to spring it on the world. Xi Jinping has decided the time is up. He's ready to demonstrate and, in fact, flaunt his capabilities, China's capabilities, and to reveal his intentions, which are not benign toward the West.
And Ian, regardless of the label that we put on this conflict, there's no doubt that the transparency is lacking. If we look at the amount of disputes that we're having, the issue of the Uyghurs, the Hong Kong security law, Taiwan, 5G, goes on and on. I mean, all of these individually could fill a show here, don't they?
Yes, and it's important that you mention those because, of course, those are not just disputes that China has with the United States. They're disputes that China has with the littoral states on the other side of the South China Sea, like the Philippines, Vietnam. They're disputes that the Chinese have with pretty much the entire advanced industrial democracy complex in terms of their unilateral decision to place this new national security law in Hong Kong. By the way, I mean, you just saw a couple weeks ago, the Indian government decide to make illegal TikTok as well as 58 other Chinese apps in response to Chinese escalation in disputed territories in the Himalayas, and of course the Uyghur issue, which President Trump doesn't care much about because he doesn't focus on human rights, but almost every other democracy in the world, I mean, Turkey's been bad on this for reasons that you can talk about domestically, or maybe you can't, but internationally, almost every other democracy has come out very strongly against China's human rights abrogations against the Uyghurs. So, I mean, this has been a really bad year for Xi Jinping. I mean, not only is the Chinese economy growing essentially flat despite 6% of GDP in stimulus, and everyone's having economic troubles right now with coronavirus, but internationally, the backlash against China is exceptionally strong. And I accept your perspective that historically China said, we don't want these problems. We just want to grow quietly and hopefully everyone won't bother us. Well, right now, you know, they're much louder internationally, and the response is not only been taken up in a bipartisan way by the United States, as Ann Lee suggests, the United States is not prepared to accept the policies that are being promoted by Xi Jinping, but also by a number of other countries around the world who have no love for President Trump. So China must be screwing up pretty badly internationally, for even in a Trump administration, for them to be getting this much backlash from this many countries. It's pretty extraordinary.
And I want to give you a chance to respond to what Ian just said, because he seems to suggest that these tensions are, for these tensions, China, first and foremost, is to be blamed. What's your take?
Well, I think that there's probably blame on both sides. China, first of all, has to understand that the U.S. is certainly not going to let their power challenged without a fight. And so they should have basically been seen this coming. But for the U.S. part, the U.S., like I said, has a foreign policy to be number one, to remain the number one superpower in the world. And that in itself also, we would have to question if that's realistic, because obviously with 7 billion people in the world, you can't possibly expect that no one's going to have any ambitions to do better. No one is going to wish that they had the same privileges that the Americans have. And so obviously, if it's not the Chinese, it's going to be another country that will sooner or later rise and also challenge U.S. hegemony. And, you know, the idea that you would go to war over this doesn't make sense when we're talking about nuclear powers. And so really, there should be a mechanism for de-escalating this and for understanding that, you know, we have to make room for all people to be able to live their lives in pursuit of happiness. I mean, that is actually what, you know, the U.S. values are here at home. And so why not extend that around the world and to give the people the opportunity to realize their dreams, but within, you know, within a certain context. And I think that China, as they've been growing, they certainly have been cooperating for the most part with international norms. And that's why China grew so large, is because they were cooperating with the rest of the world, including the U.S., for the last 40 years. And so the U.S. really needs to think about, you know, how can we develop more diplomatic tools at our disposal instead of just relying on military threats and trying to contain China, because I'm not sure that that's actually a realistic strategy going forward.
And Joseph, of course, de-escalation is very much wanted or desirable, perhaps. There's very close military encounters that we're seeing in the South China Sea. And Ben Hodges, retired General Ben Hodges, actually once said that the war with China is very likely in 15 years' time. Do you fear that this Cold War, or whatever you want to label it, could be transformed and lead to a hot war?
I certainly do. I've been concerned about that for quite some time. I believe that Western policies of, one could call them appeasement, but certainly accommodation of China's territorial and maritime ambitions have encouraged further ambition in China. And therefore, they've been more adventuristic in the South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan, and look what they're doing on human rights in China. So I think, yes, the sad answer to your question is the current dynamic could very well lead to conflict if it's allowed to continue. Now, I think the Trump administration is doing its utmost to change that dynamic, to convince China that it cannot continue on the course it is on of aggression in these various maritime areas and challenging Western values and norms throughout the world without having some kind of conflict with the West. I think if China, there's an old philosophical statement on Sun Tzu, the Chinese strategic expert and philosopher, who says the objective is to win without fighting. This is China's objective. If we convince them that they cannot win, they cannot achieve their goals of ambition and expansionism without conflict with the U.S., I think that will serve to be a very effective deterrent. And I must take one minor exception to Ms. Lee, who portrays the entire conflict as one of political and military power. I think it's much more than that. China and Russia are challenging the entire Western norms, the entire value system of the liberal democratic order. And that is something that is existential. And I think that because of that, this does not allow for an easy accommodation between these powers. But yes, it does have a military dimension as well.
Ian, is this first and foremost an ideological battle, as we saw throughout much of the 20th century, where it's the civil democracy, liberal democracy versus communism, or is this first and foremost an economic one?
It's more about power, especially because the Trump administration doesn't really have a collective ideology with the West, and the average American increasingly doesn't know what the United States stands for. But certainly the U.S. still has a preponderance of power compared to the Chinese when we think about military, diplomatic, technological, and other capabilities. The Chinese are gaining, but it's still asymmetrical. So if there is a real fight between the U.S. and China, the Chinese will be hurt more, and that does matter. Now, I mean, look, I think there are some areas where it's completely appropriate for the United States to be escalating versus the Chinese. I mean, China has not allowed American companies to enter the Chinese space and technology for some time. I mean, Facebook, Amazon, Google, they don't have access to the Chinese economy, the world's largest data market in the world. So it makes sense that the Americans would not be reciprocal and would indeed use their influence to try to ensure that Western tech firms have supremacy and the Chinese bend to the American rule set. On the other hand, we're now dealing with coronavirus, and the Chinese and the Americans and the Europeans are at cross purposes. And we should be working very closely to ensure that vaccines that are developed for everyone. And I wish the American administration would pay more attention to people like Bill Gates, Antonio Guterres, the World Health Organization, and the EU, because we'll be doing much better as a planet if we're cooperating with the Chinese in developing vaccines and rolling them out than if we're in competition. So I don't think one size fits all in the context of the U.S.-China relationship. And while I agree with Anne strongly that both sides have responsibility for different parts of this fight, I think some pieces of the fight are actually appropriate, and I would lean into them.
And would you agree that we are, of course, in the midst of a pandemic? What do you think? Do you think this pandemic will actually lead to greater cooperation in the long run between China and the U.S., or quite on the contrary, do you think it will deepen the mistrust and the conflict and tensions?
I think we already seen that it's deepened the mistrust, right? Pompeo's been going around calling it the Wuhan virus. They insist that China's responsible for unleashing the pandemic, even though there's more scientific evidence that it may not have originated in China in the first place. It's just given way to political rhetoric. And while I was hopeful that it would be a way to unite all the nations in the world when it first emerged, it's clearly not happening. And I think that it's just going to be, another area where the U.S., wants to beat China and blame China, amongst all the other things that we've talked about, whether it's the Uyghurs or Taiwan or what have you.
Joseph, of course, the 20th century was very much shaped and defined by the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Do you think that this conflict between China and the US will shape the 21st century?
I do indeed, and again, I include Russia in that dynamic. I would take one mild disagreement with Mr. Bremmer, who has portrayed the Trump administration or the president personally as being oblivious to human rights concerns. Whatever the president may say in his tweets, he has enabled and empowered Pompeo, O'Brien, a whole series of administration officials who have challenged China precisely on human rights issues, on the Uyghurs, on Hong Kong, on Falun Gong, on organ harvesting, on a range of issues. This administration has been far in advance of anything that any prior administration has done in these areas. So although it's convenient and easy to take the words of the president and say he obviously cares little about human rights, he's got an administration that does care about them, and he's letting them go full steam ahead.
Ian, I want to give you a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true that Trump isn't his entire administration. On Russia, for example, I mean, Trump has done everything possible to try to normalize relations with Putin, but everyone in his administration opposes Trump on this issue, so he hasn't been able to get anywhere on it. On China, on the Uyghurs, I mean, he sent a lot of messages to the Chinese government directly that he really wanted to move ahead on the Phase 1 trade deal, and so we wouldn't do anything in response to Uyghurs. It is certainly true that the U.S. has pushed forward with legislative sanctions against the Chinese government because of treatment of Uyghurs, and Trump didn't veto it, though there were enough votes to support to override the veto anyway. I think when the head of state in the United States is sending messages that he doesn't care about these issues, the buck ultimately stops with the president. So it's not enough to simply say, oh, his administration is doing things behind the scenes. President Trump's words actually matter. You can't claim that they don't. So on that fact, and by the way, the Chinese appreciate that. It's very useful to rogue states and their actions in terms of abrogation of human rights, that they have an American president that says we're all basically equal. We all do bad things. We all kill people, right? I mean, the Russians kill journalists. Everybody kills. Everyone does some bad things. I think it matters when you have a president who's been legitimately elected in the United States that says that he doesn't care about those issues.
And very briefly, since we are talking about the president, of course, and the U.S. finds itself in the midst of a very heated U.S. presidential election campaign right now, do you think that anything about the dynamics that we're seeing right now between U.S. and China would change with the president, Joseph Biden?
Do I?
Are you asking me if
yes,
our policies would change if it was Biden in power?
Indeed.
I don't think it's going to change a whole lot because, as we said earlier in the show, this is something that both parties embrace in Washington. In fact, it might get worse with Biden in power because he has, people like Eli Ratner running his foreign policy. And we know that, some of these folks are very hawkish in how they want to treat China. And so I don't think that we're going to see any difference here. I think that it's going to go along a certain trajectory. Maybe the tactics might be different in how to deal with China, but I certainly don't think that tensions would ratchet down.
Right. Joseph, you've been quite skeptical and pessimistic about the future of U.S.-China relations. Any silver lining out there that you're seeing?
Yes, I'm encouraged by the fact that this administration has been changing policies that have not worked for the last 40 years. I think that's very important. This was the kind of thing Trump campaigned on. One didn't know at the time how committed and serious he was to changing the relationship between China and the U.S., but he's demonstrated, and his administration has, that he is serious about that. He, of course, focuses on trade, but he's got a lot of people who focus on security and human rights, and those are keys to the relationship over the long term.
Ian, you're a very skillful and experienced player on the international scene. If both countries were to call upon you as a mediator, what would be your first line of action here?
Look, I think the first thing to focus on is not the knee-jerk reaction against China in all areas is a mistake. And I would want to see, I'd want to get into much more detail. So, for example, I mean, I have no problem with America and its allies trying to forge alternatives that are more successful than Huawei and 5G. But that doesn't mean that you want to kick Chinese out of all advanced technologies everywhere. There are a lot of places where the Americans, the Chinese, and others have worked together for good. For example, in developing alternative energy sources, very important for the planet, on things like climate. I've already mentioned the vaccine. I think we need to have much more detail in this relationship so we can show the areas that truly are ring-fenced, that we are going to appropriately be fighting in competition with the Chinese, but also areas where we need to work together. And that's why I don't like the Cold War terminology. I accept that that's the direction we're heading, but the underlying reality of the two most important economies in the world is we're going to be working together for good and for bad for a long time. And the more we recognize that reality, the better and the more sustainable our relationship will be.
Certainly a conflict that will keep us busy for quite some time. Ian Bremmer and Lee and Joseph Bosco, thank you so much for your insights. And thank you out there for watching, of course, and hope to see you again next time for a new edition of Newsmakers.